Every 4 seconds, someone in this world loses a person they love. That's 20,000 people today alone, each one standing where you may have stood, holding grief they don't know what to do with. And yet, across 2,500 years of Buddhist teaching, one truth keeps returning. Grief carries 3 hidden gifts most people never unwrap. Miss them, and loss stays only loss. Find them, and something in you quietly transforms. Today, I'll show you all 3. About 2,500 years ago, in the foothills of the Himalayas, there was a prosperous kingdom. A young prince grew up inside a palace surrounded by high stone walls. Old age was outside those walls. Illness was outside. Death was outside. Only beauty was allowed within. One spring morning, the prince mounted his horse and rode out through the gates for the very first time. The sky was clear, the breeze was gentle, but what he would see that day, he would never be able to forget for the rest of his life. An old man sat hunched by the roadside, his back bent like a branch heavy with snow, his hands trembling as he reached for a walking stick just beyond his grasp. A little further along, a woman lay feverish on a wooden cart, her shallow breath barely stirring the air around her. And at the edge of the village, 4 men carried a body wrapped in white cloth, while a child ran alongside them, crying out a name that no one answered. The prince pulled his horse to a stop and sat utterly still, the reins slack in his hands. All around him, the market continued. Vendors called out prices, a dog barked at a passing cart, 2 old friends laughed beneath a fig tree. And yet it was as though he were watching it all from the bottom of a deep river. That night, he returned to the palace, walked past the fountains and the flowering courtyards, sat down beside his sleeping wife and newborn son, and could not close his eyes until morning. The prince's name was Siddhartha, the man who would later be known as the Buddha. Riding in a carriage with his driver, he made his way slowly along the road beyond the palace gates. The first thing that caught his eye was an old man huddled by the roadside. His back was bent nearly double. He leaned his full weight on a walking stick. His skin was covered in deep wrinkles, his eyes clouded over. With every step, his body swayed, and from his lips came the faint sound of labored breathing. Without thinking, the prince turned to his driver. "What has happened to that man?" The driver answered quietly, "That is old age, my lord. As time passes, every one of us will come to look like that." The prince fell silent. Inside the palace, no one had ever grown old. They rode a little further. Then the prince saw another figure by the road, a person racked with fever. Their body trembled uncontrollably, and they seemed to have no strength left even to cry out. Those nearby were carrying water, doing what little they could, but it was clear there was nothing more to be done. "What is that?" the prince asked again. "Sickness, my lord. When the body is broken, any one of us may end up like that." The prince fell silent again. Inside the palace, no one had ever been sick. Then a third sight appeared before him. A small group of people were carrying another person. The one being carried did not move. Their face was pale, their hands looked cold to the touch, and their eyes were shut and would not open again. The people around them wept with cries that shook the air. "That is," the prince began. This time the driver paused a long moment before he answered. "Death, my lord. All that is born will one day come to that. You, me, not one of us is spared." The prince ordered the carriage to stop. For a while he simply watched. There were people weeping. There was someone who had taken hold of the dead person's hand and would not let go. There was someone crying out in a voice too broken for words. A question rose inside the prince's chest. Where does a person who has died go? What are those who are left behind supposed to do? What is this grief for? On the way home that day, the prince encountered a fourth figure. It was a solitary monk, dressed in plain, worn robes. He carried nothing. He walked in utter stillness. Old age, illness, death, none of it seemed to have cast a shadow across his face. That quietness struck the prince as something he couldn't understand. Why is that man so at peace? He is one who has chosen to look directly at suffering, my lord, the driver replied. That night the prince sat for a long time with his eyes closed. Music played through the palace. Beautiful things filled every corner. but none of it reached him anymore. Burned into the backs of his eyelids was the image of those people carrying the one who had died. He thought of the hands that had refused to let go. He thought of the voice too broken for words, and he understood, for the first time, that all the silk and lamplight in the world could not soften what was waiting at the end of every road. What Siddhartha saw when he rode out through the gates was 4 sights: old age, illness, death, and a monk in stillness. This story is known as the 4 encounters at the gates. Why has this story been held so precious throughout the history of Buddhism? Because it is the story of the moment death was received as a question. The prince saw a dead person, and he grieved. But at the same time, he held a question. And that question became the seed from which the whole of Buddhist thought would one day grow. Let's pause here for a moment. When we lose someone we love, what kind of pain do we feel? I'm suffering because that person is gone. That's what we tend to think. But is that all there is to it? When we look more closely at our pain, we begin to see other layers beneath the surface. The regret of I should have done more. The loneliness of why am I the one left behind. The ache of I'll never see them again. And beneath all of that, something deeper still, the fear that I too will die someday. The suffering doesn't come only from the person leaving. It comes from somewhere we may not immediately notice, a belief rooted deeply inside us that the person would always be there, that their voice, their face, their presence would stay with us forever, exactly as they were. When reality tears that belief away, suffering is born. This is what Buddhism calls the origin of suffering. It isn't that suffering itself is the problem. Suffering has a cause, and looking clearly at that cause, that is where Buddhism begins. The question Siddhartha asked about the monk, why is that person at peace, comes from the very same place. Old age, illness, death, all of it was right there in front of him. And yet somehow that person was at ease. Why? The answer wasn't that the monk had no suffering, it was that the monk's relationship with suffering was different. And here's something else I'd like us to sit with. When you hear the words, the bond between the living and the dead, where do you look for that connection? At the graveside, when you look at a photograph, in a dream where they come back to you. Buddhism sees that connection in a slightly different place. The reason you are here today is because that person was here. Their words entered you, and something grew inside you. Their presence shaped the way you think. The time you shared with them made your now the shape it is. What we call I is not a fixed self that then reaches out to connect with others. Connection comes first. I is what takes form afterward, within that web of connection. If that is true, then even after someone we love is gone, the connection we had with them has not disappeared. It is already woven into you. The tea you brew each morning the way they taught you. The route you still walk because they once walked it beside you. These are not mere habits. They are the shape that love leaves behind in a life. This teaching breathes quietly inside several moments of ordinary life. Think, for instance, about what it's like after a parent dies. For some people, after a parent passes, they simply can't function for a while. They can't eat, they can't sleep. They go to do something and the tears just come. I can't bring myself to do anything, some people say. That pain is real, I would never dismiss it, but sometimes something happens. You're in the kitchen and you suddenly notice you've seasoned the dish exactly the way your parent always did. You're searching for the right words to say, and the phrasing that comes out of your mouth is one your parent always used. You're trying to teach your child something, and what you say is almost word for word what your parent once said to you. In that moment, what do you feel? Some people feel it. Oh, they're still here. Something is continuing even though the form has changed. This is not a comfort. In Buddhist terms, it is called dependent origination, the truth that all things arise through connection. The connection between you and your parent is still moving inside you, still alive, still taking new forms. That is simply what is true. Let me show you another moment. I once heard from someone who had lost the partner they had been with for many years. The first year, the nights were the hardest, they said. No one beside them. They'd speak and no answer came. They'd turn on the television, and still the silence was deafening. At some point, they began a new habit. Before bed each night, they would speak their day out loud. There was no reply, but in the telling they felt something inside themselves settle into place. When I talk and think, That's probably what they would say. Somehow the answer comes into focus, they told me. Where does that sense of that's what they would say come from? It grew inside you, slowly, over a long stretch of time. The way your partner thought, the way they saw things, the cadence of their voice, the way they made decisions. All of it took root in you, and it is still alive there now. That person is gone. Half of that is true. But the fact that they were here cannot be undone. And that fact is part of what made you who you are today. There is a third moment, from someone a little younger. A person who had lost their grandfather as a small child told me that as an adult, they found themselves thinking of him often without quite knowing why. Especially when they were stuck at work or lost in a difficult relationship, he would just drift into their mind. His face is blurry now. I can't even remember his voice anymore. But the image of his back as he worked quietly in the fields, that I can still see clearly. That image doesn't say anything, but every time it appears, this person feels something shift. I'll try a little longer. No words, and yet something is arriving. If that is not the bond between the living and the dead, what else could we call it? The grandfather planted something without knowing he was planting it. He was simply working, shoulders bent, hands moving, and a small child was watching from somewhere nearby, taking it all in, without understanding what they were taking. That is how the deepest things are passed, not in the moments we prepare for, but in the ordinary ones we barely notice we are living. After he rode out through the gates, Siddhartha went deep into practice, and one thing became the center of it, not turning away from death. Most of us tend to avoid thinking about it. It feels like bad luck. It frightens us. Let's think about something brighter, we say, and look away. But Siddhartha began by looking directly at death. He didn't avert his eyes. And because of that, the question, then what truly matters right now, came into sharp, clear focus. Today, I'd like to ask you to try just one thing. Call to mind the face of someone you've lost. Then put into words, just one, something you received from that person. It doesn't have to be words. It could be the taste of a dish they made, a phrase they always said, a view you used to look at together, just noticing what was given to you. This isn't a ritual of gratitude. It isn't about making the person you lost into something more than they were, or forcing your grief to an end before it's ready. It is simply a quiet act of confirming that person came into this world, that time with them existed. In Buddhism, there is a tradition of reading sutras for those who have died. It may look like giving something to the dead, but it is also an act of settling something inside the living. The time we spend thinking of the dead casts a gentle light on the now of those who remain. Tonight, before you sleep, even just 1 minute, let the face of someone you've lost come into your mind and say just one thing, quietly inside yourself. From you I received this. I can't promise anything will change, but that 1 minute might lay a quiet bridge between who you are today and the one who is no longer here. And perhaps in that stillness before sleep, you will find that the bridge goes both ways, that in remembering them, something of you is also remembered, called back to itself. A woman once told me that every autumn, when the persimmons ripened, she could hear her grandmother's voice without trying. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't sat down to grieve. The fruit had simply kept the appointment for her. The dead do not always wait for us to be ready. Sometimes they arrive in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, in the smell of rain on warm pavement, or in the particular way afternoon light falls across a kitchen floor. And in that moment, without ceremony, the bridge is already there beneath your feet. Is there someone still living inside you? Someone you can no longer see? And yet, out of nowhere, their words come back to you. Do those words speak to something in who you are today? There's no need to rush toward an answer. Just sit with the question for a little while. A monk once told me that he kept hearing his grandmother's voice every time he was about to tell a lie, not scolding him, just quietly saying his name. He never once met her as an adult. She died when he was 4 years old. He said it took him 20 years to understand that her voice wasn't a memory. It was a teaching, still unfolding, like a seed she had planted in the dark, long before he had the soil to receive it. Some people leave us before we are ready to know them, and yet they stay, patient as roots, waiting for us to grow down deep enough to find them. The question of how we remain connected across that threshold was explored in a previous teaching, what it truly means to live on in the hearts of those left behind. Siddhartha stood still before the dead. He didn't run. He didn't reach for comfort. He simply looked at death. And in that same gaze, he found the stillness of the monk. The person who had looked most directly at death was the most at peace. This is where Buddhism begins. When we lose someone we love, we see their absence. No voice, no face, no warmth. That absence becomes the pain. But there is another way of seeing. The fact that they were here, that cannot be taken away. The time they were here made you who you are. The memory of them is still moving something inside you. Even now, between the living and the dead, there is an invisible thread. It isn't spiritual, it isn't mysterious, it is simply the trace of a connection. The weight of shared time. That thread doesn't need either person to pull on it. It is simply there. The fact that you are here today, that is already proof of it. Thank you for being here with me today, all the way to the end. A man once told me that every morning, without thinking, he still bought 2 cups of coffee. His wife had been gone for 3 years. He would set the second cup on the table, sit across from it, and drink his own in silence. He said he didn't know why he kept doing it, but I think he did know. The thread was still there, and that was his way of holding it. He wasn't mourning, he was staying close. May today's words quietly take root within you. 1 story a day. In a week your words will change. In a month your eyes will change. In a year the same world will look completely different.